Listen up, this is the refreshed 2024 Porsche Cayenne, and in this video I'm going to detail all of the changes related to the interior, the exterior, the upgrades related to the engine and the suspension, and of course take it for a quick drive. So let's find out what this .2 refreshed Cayenne is all about. So the refreshed Cayenne, not to be confused with a new generation, this is still the 9YO, making this refreshed model the 9YO.2. Now the one I have here today is the base Cayenne Coupe, but it has a huge list of options, ballooning the base price from $84,000 and change to $111,000 and change. But hey, that's no surprise for a Porsche given the a la carte option list. Anyways, before jumping in, a thank you to Porsche of downtown LA for giving me access to this Cayenne. They've got a couple of these in stock, so give them a ring if you want one. Now let's start it out with the changes on the exterior. So Porsche tweaked the front end with revised fenders, a new hood, and redesigned headlights, which in my opinion are better looking than the outgoing ones. Out back, it's mostly the same. The taillight is new and it's got the Porsche lettering exposed as opposed to being covered by the taillight in the pre-refresh. But overall, outside of the headlights, you'd be hard pressed to notice a huge difference with this refresh. Regardless, I was a fan of the pre-refresh look, and I'm still a fan of the way this one looks too. So now let's talk about some of the mechanical updates that Porsche gave across the Cayenne lineup, starting out with the engine. So in an extremely unprecedented fashion, Porsche has decided to up the cylinder count in the Cayenne S, going from a V6 to a V8, which now generates 468 horsepower and 442 pounds-feet of torque. Now the one we've got today is a base model, so the engine is still the single turbocharged V6, but not to worry because Porsche did upgrade the power here as well, and it now generates 348 horsepower and 368 pounds-feet of torque. Now this increase didn't really materialize much in terms of acceleration because the 0 to 60 time is still 5.7 seconds in the base Cayenne. The suspension components have been tweaked as well, with the base Cayenne, the S, and the E hybrid all coming with a fixed spring suspension and PASM of course. And with the new revisions, Porsche says that the Cayenne should ride more comfortably at slow speeds and better manage its body movements at higher speeds. So we'll be the judge of that during the drive. Now there's also an air suspension which is standard on the top of the line GT, but you can equip it in any of the Cayenne trims as a standalone option, as it is with this example. So now let's talk about the interior, where the changes are a little bit more apparent compared to the .1, starting out with technology. So replacing the hybrid digital/analog gauge cluster is this beautiful 12.6-inch curved widescreen display, which is basically being lifted directly from the Taycan, and I really like this thing. I like the way it looks, I like its functional capabilities, and it's highly configurable on top of all of that. It's one of my favorite things in the Taycan's interior, and that continues here in the Cayenne. Now moving to the infotainment screen, it's a 12.3-inch display, which is unchanged from the .1 generation. It's a great screen, blended very nicely into the dash, and it's running the latest version of PCM, which has drastically improved throughout its iterations. And I'm not going to go into much detail about the infotainment, PCM that is, because I've covered it in detail in a lot of my other Porsche reviews. Just know that it's one of my favorites because it's very simple, it's easy to use, the user interface is nicely laid out, and the graphics look very nice as well. Now one thing that is new in the Cayenne that you weren't able to get in the .1 generation is a front passenger display, which again is being lifted directly from the Taycan. Now that screen over there is 10 inches, but what's more interesting about it is that from a driver's seating position standpoint, I cannot look over and at least clearly see what's going on over there, because it seems like there's some privacy glass or some coating on there that will not allow the driver to get distracted by what's going on the passenger screen. And as a result, the passenger has the ability to access a lot of functionality from the screen. But not only that, some entertainment features as well. You can stream video on this passenger side screen, and that by itself is pretty cool. Now let's talk some design changes on the interior, starting out with the transmission controller. So it's the same thing as what you see in the Taycan, with the same shape and even the same placement up on the dash. If you've driven a Taycan before, you'll know what to look for, but I remember the first time I jumped in a Taycan, I was like, where the heck is the shifter? Anyway, as a result of moving the shifter up on the dash, you have a massively decluttered and open center area. The AC controls have been revised and are lined up nicely. There's more storage room, and overall it's drastically simpler and less cluttered. Next, moving to the ignition. If you've driven a Porsche before, you know that the ignition is on the left side, but no longer is there a knob to turn right, because you've got a start-stop button, and that's as a result of keyless entry and go being standard on all Cayennes. This is kind of a letdown for me, and not the standard equipment part, but the lack of a knob. I wish they still had the knob there, but hey, I just hope they don't do this in the 911. Don't let me down, Porsche. Now, a couple other interior details before we take this thing for a drive. The steering wheel design has basically been lifted from a 911, and you also get a drive mode selector as standard now across the Cayenne lineup. And Porsche's doing this in hopes of making the interior a little bit more sportier in the Cayenne, and I certainly like it. Now, what else can I tell you? The back seat space, even though this is the more compromised sloping roof coupe variant of the Cayenne, at 5'11", sitting back there, I have an ample amount of space. Headroom is good, legroom is also good. Now, moving all the way to the back in the trunk, it's unchanged and has a decent 22 cubic feet of space with the seats folded up and 54.3 with them folded down. So now that we've pretty much covered most of the major interior changes of the new Cayenne, now let's take it for a drive and see what it feels like behind the wheel. All right, so let's see what this thing feels like behind the wheel. Start, stop over here on the left, foot on the brake. Starts up, nice and quiet. And the overall interior is really quiet in this Cayenne. So let's go for a quick roll here and see what this .2 Cayenne is all about. Got a bunch of messages here on my infotainment screen. But let's go ahead and test the acceleration very quickly, and let's switch using the drive mode selector into Sport Plus. And what that will do is lower the car to its lowest air suspension setting, change the chassis into Sport Plus, and the drive mode overall, the throttle response will also go into Sport Plus. You can definitely feel the ride height difference when you're in the lowest ride height compared to the highest. So let's see now. Cayenne, accelerate. Okay, properly quick, decent. Brake, good. Good brake too, nice bite at the top of the pedal. As you would expect in a car of this nature, of course, this is the base model, but decent braking as well. Let's downshift to second, mash. Takes a second there. Okay, pretty good, pretty good. Now, of course, this is the base level trim, almost 350 horsepower, and I drove it in multiple different settings. Here on the street in downtown LA, I got a chance to get on the highway and drive it around there. And this performs as you would expect a car of this power range and of this weight to perform. It's adequate in daily driving situations, passing on the highway, merging onto the highway, more than enough power there. So it did gain some horsepower, I believe roughly 14 compared to the pre-refresh. And I don't know if there's really that much of a difference there from a speed standpoint or a horsepower standpoint. Of course, the acceleration numbers remain the same. It's 5.7 seconds, 0 to 60. But one area where you can feel somewhat of a slight difference is that 40 additional pounds-feet of torque gain, and that's very useful for daily driving situations because torque for a big heavy car like this is a lot more important than horsepower to get you going and give you that thrust you need in stop-and-go situations and things of that nature. So the torque is a little bit more important, but again, adequate to be able to drive this on a daily basis. So let's switch over into the suspension and the steering feedback, and this is something where there's good and then there's some points that are somewhat head scratching. So let me explain. The good. So when you're driving this thing around, as I mentioned, in the city, on the highway, this thing is sublime. The air suspension is magic. I'm sitting here in the 14-way seat, and this feels like a proper luxury car to the level of a sedan type of luxury element. And in an SUV, that's actually remarkable, very nicely done by Porsche. And of course, the air suspension is all the magic there, but it soaks up all the bumps. It's very easy to drive, and driving this on a daily basis would be a wonderful, wonderful experience. So switching that over, actually before switching over, one other important thing that I always like to cover with air suspensions is even in its lowest ride height, because I suspect some folks are going to buy this thing and drive around in the lowest ride height because it just looks cooler that way, and this one's got the 21-inch wheels, so it does look a little better when it's slammed or dropped, for the lack of a better term. And even in this low ride height, it's still adequate and more than comfortable enough to be driven on a daily basis. Now let's switch over, and let me turn the air condition on. It's actually a little hot today. All right, AC on. Okay, so the head scratching part, and that is related to the sportiness, and this was, excuse me, very surprising for me driving a Porsche and a little bit outside of my expectation. So I feel like this is lacking some sportiness, and the reason why I say that is because when I jump into a Porsche product, I'm expecting something very sporty or sportier than what I would see in any other brand, because Porsche is equivalent to sportiness. Whether you're driving a base car or a sporty 911 GT3, they're supposed to feel sporty. That's the DNA of the Porsche product, and I feel like there's something missing here. Granted, yes, some people might say, oh, this is the base model, it's a big heavy SUV, blah 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 blah, but again, my experience and my expectation of Porsche products has been that even when I drive a base Panamera, I've driven the base Macan, that's properly sporty even in its base trim level. Obviously, the Cayman, the Boxster 911 in their base trim levels are very sporty, but again, I feel like this might even be a little step backwards in terms of the sportiness compared to the pre-refresh one that I've driven. And I don't know if I just need to drive it around a little bit more, but I feel like some of the edge has been taken off specifically for sportiness, and this might be a little bit more tailored for daily driving situations like this. Anyways, so let me touch on a couple other things, some miscellaneous items. I saw that there were some concerns, when I say I saw, I read on the forums, there were some concerns about the gauge cluster not having a hood to protect it from sunlight. And again, it's a very sunny day out here in SoCal, and I've driven it in bright sunny settings when the sun is directly hitting the windshield. No issues with visibility on the gauge cluster, all digital gauge cluster. And also, one other thing I read is the quality of the leather. Now, I can't directly comment on the concern which was with the base trim level, because this has the very expensive club leather interior, and the quality in here is fantastic, and the overall design change in here flows beautifully. So to wrap things up, the Cayenne is still a wonderful Porsche experience. Everything that you would expect from a Porsche, with the quality, the layout, the overall Porsche experience when you get behind the wheel of one of these things is still here. The only thing that I noticed is the fact that this thing, obviously that sportiness is a little different, I guess, for the lack of a better term, but still a wonderful, wonderful car from Porsche with this .2 experience. So that's the refreshed .2 2024 Porsche Cayenne. Porsche really went above and beyond the normal definition of a mid-cycle refresh, because this is actually quite extensive. You've got new styling, new engines, and revised technology on the interior with a 12-inch gauge cluster. Now, I was already a fan of the .1 generation, and that also continues here with the .2. So that's all I've got. If you've got any questions, please make sure you leave me a comment down below or send me a message on Instagram at DriveSteady. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Otherwise, thank you for watching this video. Until next time, drive steady.